If you think the trade war between Canada and the United States is just about lumber and potatoes and steel tariffs, if you think this is a story about two governments arguing over trade deficits and supply chains, then buckle up right now, because what Canada just built in Ottawa and Montreal is something that the American defense industry genuinely did not see coming, something that changes the balance of power in North American aerospace technology, and something that is going to cost General Atomics, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and every other American defense contractor that has spent decades counting on Canadian dependents billions of dollars in contracts they assumed were guaranteed forever. Canada just invested $900 million to build its own drone innovation hub, its own airborne defense research platform, and its own path to military technology independence. And it did it using a Canadian jet built by Bombardier, designed and modified in British Columbia and Quebec, tested by Canadian researchers, and specifically engineered to operate in the one environment where American drones have consistently struggled and where Canada has the most urgent national security need, the Arctic. And before we get into exactly what was built, where it is, what it can do, and why the American defense industry is watching this with the kind of attention that does not show up in press releases, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell, because this story is part of a much larger transformation that is happening north of the border right now, and you do not want to miss a single update. So let us go back to the beginning, because this decision did not happen in a vacuum, and the context makes it far more dramatic than the numbers alone suggest. For decades, Canada's approach to military technology was simple and consistent: buy American, depend on American supply chains, integrate with American systems, and trust that the relationship was stable enough that dependence was not a vulnerability but a feature, a sign of how deep the alliance ran and how seamlessly the two countries operated together. Canada was in the process of buying 11 MQ-9B Reaper drones from General Atomics, the American company that manufactures the most widely deployed armed drone in the Western world. A $2.49 billion contract that was supposed to give the Royal Canadian Air Force its first long-range surveillance drone fleet, and those 11 aircraft were supposed to be the backbone of Canada's Arctic surveillance capability for the next generation. And then Donald Trump came back to the White House and called Canada the 51st state, slapped 45% tariffs on Canadian goods, threatened to tear up the trade agreement that underpins the entire North American economy, and made it crystal clear that depending on American weapon systems, American supply chains, and American goodwill was not a strategic asset for Canada, it was a strategic liability. Mark Carney won a landslide election in April 2025 on a platform built entirely around changing that calculation, and the $900 million drone hub announced this month is the most concrete and the most technically significant expression of what changing that calculation actually looks like in practice. Here is exactly what Canada built and why every detail matters to the American defense industry. The National Research Council of Canada, which is Canada's leading government research institution, founded during the First World War specifically to develop military technology, has been directed to invest over $900 million in 3 interconnected programs that together represent the most ambitious expansion of Canadian defense technology capacity in a generation. The centerpiece is the Drone Innovation Hub, a new dedicated research and development facility that will operate out of 2 locations: Ottawa, the national capital, and the Mirabel area north of Montreal, which is one of Canada's most important aerospace manufacturing corridors and home to facilities operated by Bombardier, CAE, Pratt, and Whitney Canada, and dozens of smaller aerospace technology companies that supply both commercial and military customers globally. The hub's mandate is to advance research, development, and commercialization of drone technologies for defense, security, and dual-use applications, which means it is not just building drones for the Canadian military. It is building a domestic drone industry capable of competing globally, supplying allied militaries, and reducing Canada's dependence on American drone technology across every sector, from Arctic surveillance to disaster response to commercial logistics. The second component is the acquisition of a Canadian-built Bombardier Global 6500 business jet that will be converted into an airborne defense research laboratory. And this is where the story becomes technically extraordinary, because the choice of the Global 6500 is not a coincidence, and it is not a cost-saving measure. It is a deliberate strategic decision that tells you exactly what Canada intends to do with this investment. The Bombardier Global 6500 is one of the most capable business jets ever built, with a range of 6,500 nautical miles, the ability to fly at 51,000 feet, a cruise speed of 531 miles per hour, and a cabin large enough to house the sensor arrays, data processing systems, and communications equipment that modern defense research requires. And critically, for Canada's most urgent security need, it is specifically engineered to operate in Arctic conditions that have caused persistent problems for American drone platforms, including the MQ-9 Reaper. The MQ-9B Reaper that Canada was in the process of buying from General Atomics has a documented performance limitation in Arctic environments, a fact that Canadian defense officials have been raising internally for years, with the manufacturer claiming the aircraft performs well in challenging climates, but Canadian officials determining that modifications were necessary to ensure adaptability to the harsh Arctic environment. And those modifications, combined with the requirement to incorporate locally made electronic surveillance equipment, had already been pushing the delivery timeline for Canada's 11 Reapers well past the originally planned 2025 delivery date. Now, Canada has a different answer to that problem: not buy a modified American drone, build the domestic capability to develop and test drone systems that are designed from the outset for Arctic operations, using a Canadian airframe built in Toronto and modified in Abbotsford, British Columbia, and Dorval, Quebec, tested by Canadian researchers at the NRC's Aerospace Research Centre near Ottawa's airport, and capable of flying far into the Arctic and overseas with a range that exceeds the NRC's existing research fleet by more than double. Defense Minister David McGuinty stood at the announcement and said, "If you need any other evidence of the need for this research, turn on the newscasts." And that line is doing an enormous amount of work, because what is on the newscasts right now is a war in the Middle East in which Ukraine's model of drone warfare, 450 drone companies supplying a battlefield in real time, has permanently changed how every military in the world thinks about unmanned systems. And Canada watched that lesson the same way every other NATO member watched it and is now acting on it. Industry Minister Melanie Joly said Canada's security depends on our ability to innovate at home, and added that the investment will strengthen Canada's sovereign capabilities in next-generation aerospace, drone, quantum, and biomedical technologies. And the word sovereign is doing exactly the same work that it has been doing in every major Canadian policy announcement since Carney took office. It is the word that means we are no longer willing to accept dependence on a single supplier who has demonstrated that dependence can be weaponized. The broader context of this investment is part of a $6.6 billion defense industrial strategy that Carney's government unveiled in February, a 5-year plan that commits Canada to a buy Canadian approach to military procurement, a doubling of Canada's defense exports, and the creation of 125,000 new jobs in the defense industry over the next decade. And the $900 million drone hub is the first major concrete announcement under that strategy, which means it is not an isolated investment. It is the opening move in a fundamental restructuring of how Canada thinks about military technology and who it buys it from. Now, here is the part that should make every American watching this think carefully about what the next decade looks like in North American defense. And it is the part that defense analysts are describing as the real long-term consequence of Trump's trade war that nobody is talking about. For 70 years, the United States has been the default supplier of advanced military technology to Canada, not because Canada lacked the industrial capacity to develop alternatives, but because the relationship was stable, the integration was deep, and the assumption of American goodwill was so embedded in Canadian strategic thinking that it functioned as a given rather than a variable. That assumption is now a variable, and Canada is acting accordingly. Canada and Japan signed an agreement this year to exchange military technologies and co-develop new weapon systems, giving Ottawa an additional supply source outside the American defense procurement model, and Canada formally joined the European Union's SAFE program, the rearmament initiative designed to strengthen the defense industrial base of allied nations, making Canada the only non-EU member of a program whose purpose is to build a defense architecture that does not require American approval. Canada is reviewing its $27 billion F-35 contract with Lockheed Martin, with Swedish company Saab offering to build Gripen jets inside Canada and create 12,600 aerospace jobs at home rather than in Texas. And Canada is in active discussions with German and South Korean companies about submarine procurement that would give it a major naval capability built outside the American defense industrial complex. And now Canada has a $900 million drone hub in Ottawa and Montreal that will, over the next decade, produce the technologies, the companies, the researchers, and the institutional knowledge that would allow Canada to develop and export drone systems without needing to license American technology, use American components, or seek American export approval. Hamari, the CEO of a Canadian aerospace company that has been working with the NRC's research aircraft, described what the new Bombardier Global 6500 means for his company in a way that captures the full strategic picture in a single sentence. He said it is going to take us global, that it will allow his company to fly long-endurance missions to Europe, to the United States, overseas, work with coalition partners, and turn the aircraft into a living lab with all sorts of integrations and collaborations. A Canadian drone company executive describing the new government research aircraft as something that will allow him to go to Europe and work with coalition partners, not to the United States but to Europe, not buying American technology but exporting Canadian technology to allied nations that are building their own defense architectures independent of American supply chains, is the clearest possible statement of where Canadian defense industry strategy is heading and why the American companies that have counted on Canadian procurement as a guaranteed revenue stream for decades are watching this with very close attention. Trump called Canada the 51st state and slapped it with 45% tariffs and threatened to tear up the trade agreement that supports 14 million North American jobs. And Canada responded by investing $900 million to build the technology that will make it less dependent on American defense suppliers, by reviewing the $27 billion F-35 contract, by joining European defense initiatives, by partnering with Japan on weapons co-development, and by launching the most ambitious domestic defense industrial strategy in a generation. And the defense minister said, if you need any other evidence of the need for this research, turn on the newscasts. If this video told you something about what is really happening in the defense relationship between Canada and the United States that the mainstream trade war coverage is not putting together for you, do me a favor right now and share it with someone who deserves to know the full story. Because what is being built in Ottawa and Montreal is not just a drone hub, it is the physical infrastructure of a country that has decided it will never again be in a position where a single trading partner can threaten its security by threatening its supply chains, and the companies and workers and policymakers who are making that decision have been watching the same newscasts as the rest of us. We will be right here covering every development as it happens. Stay tuned and stay informed.